Good morning. It's nice to be back here with you. As he said, I'm with Hilton and glad to kind of lead their global diversity and inclusion efforts. I also serve on the IGLTA Board of Directors and I serve as their vice chair. Very pleased and honored that Hilton is a part of IGLTA. I wanted to take a moment to say thank you to John Tanzella and the staff on celebrating 35 years with IGLTA. It was nice to see the video yesterday and kind of see the trajectory over these last 35 years. Very impressive what this team has been able to accomplish. So congratulations on your success. So I'm honored to introduce our next panel entitled The Intersection of Human Rights and Tourism. Our discussion will be moderated today by Fabrice Oudard. He is a human rights officer with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. I thought my title was long. That's really long. And he's based in New York City. Fabrice works on the Free and Equal Campaign, an unprecedented United Nations global education campaign for LGBT equality. He also leads the UN Global LGBTI Standards of Conduct for Businesses on Tackling LGBTI Discrimination, which was launched just this last September. And previously, Fabrice was a senior country officer with the World Bank from 2001 to 2016. He holds a bachelor's degree of economics and management in Dauphine University in Paris and has an MBA from American University in Washington, D.C. He lives in New York with his 5-year-old twin sons, Maxime and Eitan. And the format for today is that Fabrice will kind of speak for a few moments and then kind of lead the panel discussion. So Fabrice, why don't you go ahead and come up, and I'll also introduce our distinguished panel for you today. First up is Helen Kennedy, Executive Director of EGAL, Canada Human Rights Trust. Next up, we have Sean Howell, Co-founder and President of Hornet. Next up, we have Kevin Dallas, CEO of Bermuda Tourism Authority. Dinesh Pereira, founder of Fuzu Travel. So please refer to your convention app or program for their biographical information. Please help me welcome them to this panel.
So I'm going to take my watch out to make sure that I don't speak for the entire time, so that we have time for a little discussion. So good afternoon. My office, as John mentioned, my office published a standard of conduct in September, and basically the standards of conduct are telling the private sector globally that it's time to scale up their games when it comes to the human rights of LGBTI people. The standards have received so far, since we launched them in September, the support of more than 120 of the largest companies in the world. And today I'm delighted to take this opportunity to announce that Hyatt is officially joining the early supporter of the standard. So let's clap for Hyatt. By doing so, Hyatt is actually joining other key companies in the tourism industry, such as Airbnb, American Airlines, the Lalit Hotels, Lufthansa, Marriott, Virgin, which have already expressed support. Thanks to all these companies for their leadership. Today, our wonderful panel is going to discuss how the tourism industry can implement these standards and put human rights of LGBTI people in its agenda. I'm particularly glad to have this discussion and to have been kindly invited by the IGLTA and John to have this panel, because I really believe that the tourism industry has a key role to play in the struggle for equality. It exposes people to each other's cultures and brings them together. Yesterday I was listening to Dinesh Pereira, who is on our panel, the founder of Fuzu Travel in Sri Lanka, and he described how, by having LGBTI clients coming to his hotel, he's exposing his staff to LGBTI people, and in turn, these staff come back to their family and their communities and change the attitudes towards LGBTI people. And I really believe that social change happens one conversation at a time. Of course, we have to push for legal changes, and of course, we have to support grassroots movements. But in the end, everything that we have observed in North America and in parts of Europe has been those individual conversations that Dinesh is starting to have in Sri Lanka. As you know better than me, the tourism industry is one of the world's largest industries, with a global economic contribution of over $7.6 trillion. Tourism provides 10% of the world's GDP, 7% of global trade, and as many as 1 in every 11 jobs globally. Dee was mentioning yesterday that for Sri Lanka only, 11.6% of their GDP comes from tourism. It's a voice that cannot be ignored and has the power to contribute to expand the historic shift in public attitudes that we have observed in North America and parts of Europe. This shift in public attitude is urgently needed, and that's something I talk about all the time. Because there is a gigantic difference between the time when I came out and today, which is that when I came out, I had no idea that you could live a life of dignity and opportunity as a gay man. Now the reality is that everybody I meet, even in middle city in Tunisia, have an idea that if they could come to a more tolerant place, they could lead a life of dignity and opportunity and reach their potential. And this leads to gigantic despair and often migration for those who speak English or have the ability to secure a visa. Unfortunately, it is unsustainable for us to think that we can welcome every single LGBTI person in the more tolerant areas in the world. I would usually start such remarks by reminding the audience that for all the progress we have made in the past decades, millions of LGBT people remain trapped in a climate of hostility, violence, and stigma. And for some of them, life is getting harder rather than easier. Sadly, I don't need to, because anybody that has a television has seen this year mass arrests in Azerbaijan, in Indonesia, in Egypt. We have seen more than 200 people rounded up, detained, and in some cases tortured. And all of this happened on the heels of the appalling, gigantic human rights violations that we observed in Chechnya last year. Outright Action International, which is a global NGO based in New York, recently told me that the scale of these government crackdowns makes last year the worst year ever. But beyond these horrendous headlines, in 70 countries, homosexuality is still criminalized. And in many cases, people are arrested and imprisoned and even executed for being gay. And in 17 countries, bans are in place against so-called gay propaganda. That's more than a third of the world's population and the world's LGBT population, who lives in countries that either criminalize same-sex relationships or prohibit LGBT activism. For trans people, the situation is arguably even more dire, with millions forced to live on the margins of society or subjected to sterilization and forced treatment at the price, and having their in order to get their gender identity legally recognized. Despite tremendous progress over the past 25 years, we are witnessing today an unprecedented proliferation of hate speech and human rights abuses against LGBTI people. And yesterday, I had a meeting with Dee and the IGLTA Foundation, and our representative from Brazil was talking about how there is hate speech as part of the current presidential campaign in Brazil. And we are kind of observing the same type of speech in Costa Rica, in Mexico, as part of the electoral process. And these are countries in which we thought we had achieved gigantic gains. And this is extremely worrying. And we should not forget that even in the most tolerant places, including here in Canada, the situation, our journey is far from over. Conversion therapy for minors is still legal in Canada, as it's legal in 40 states in the United States, as it's legal in the United Kingdom. And we at the UN Human Rights Office consider it a form of torture against LGBTI people. At the UN, we believe in the crucial role of the private sector in tackling discrimination and providing a path to acceptance and inclusion for LGBTI people around the world. We shouldn't be under the illusion that the private sector can trigger social change, because what we have observed throughout the world is that social change comes from grassroots movements. In the United States, Stonewall did not wait for Pan Am to stand up for them in order to change the perception of American of LGBTI people. But this being said, the private sector can support this grassroots movement and contribute to social change. And we are observing, actually, in Singapore, in Uganda, or in Hong Kong, that business is taking a critical role in globally supporting those grassroots movements. At this time of great flux, when huge gains are made in many countries of the West and Latin America and parts of Asia, we have to focus on consolidating and extending those gains. And when LGBTI communities are more visible, and in some cases facing pushback in parts of the world where they were previously relegated to the shadows, we need your help more than ever to get all companies, irrespective of their size, location or industry, to step up in meeting responsibilities and opportunities on the human rights of LGBTI people. The decision that companies take, whether in respect of human resources, investment, their supply chains, even marketing, can have a real and in some cases profound impact on human rights. Recently, I was watching a video that Procter & Gamble launched for their product Vicks, that you rub on the chest of baby when they have a cold. And in India, they had an advertising that presented a transgender mother with her daughter. It's called Touch of Care, and I really encourage you to watch it on YouTube. This video had more than 10 million views on YouTube. It triggered gigantic conversation in the media. In many ways, Procter & Gamble has much more clout when it comes to influencing perception of LGBTI people than the United Nations, or even sadly, nascent grassroots movements in India. The private sector is playing a critical role in shaping public attitudes. So let me conclude by encouraging you to contribute in raising awareness about these standards. I brought a few copies with me, and I will be delighted to give them to you. The time for change has come, and the private sector can and should play a leading role. So I'm very happy to be joined on stage today by Kevin Dallas with the Bermuda Tourism. You can recognize him to his bright yellow Bermuda shorts. Ellen Kennedy, with the executive director of IGLTA, the Canadian LGBTI advocacy organization that dates back to 1986. Not Ellen, but the organization.
I wish it was 1986.
But Ellen is also the co-chair of ILGA, the International Gay and Lesbian Association. Sean Howell, my friend, who I have known since he was a little kid, and is the co-founder of Hornet, and also a leading player in the LGBT token. I don't know if you will have a chance to mention it in your remarks. And then my friend Dee of Fuzu Travels in Sri Lanka. And before I start this panel, I want to remind you that all of this has no clout if it's not on social media. So please, we have kind of a, I don't know if I have a little remote. I don't have a remote to, it's right there, awesome. So because I have a hashtag, and it's very important that you use that hashtag. Yeah, it's right at the bottom right there. So you use that hashtag, and then, of course, the IGLTA 2018 hashtag, and then we can follow you on Twitter, on social media, and then we can be sure that this panel did actually happen. So, I let you also introduce yourself a little more, because I basically didn't say much about you. But my first question is for Dee. So Dee, you described yourself yesterday in that meeting we had together, not only as a travel specialist, but also as an activist, which I find wonderful. I love activists. So homosexuality is still illegal in Sri Lanka under Article 365A. Is there an emerging LGBTI civil society in Sri Lanka? What are the bigger bottlenecks to acceptance? And do you feel that the private sector can contribute? And can you answer to that in 1.5 minutes?
Yes, I will try my best. Okay. So Sri Lanka's culture of discrimination against LGBTI happened thanks to the British, with the 365A being in place, basically making homosexuality an illegal activity in Sri Lanka. Now, it has been in place for such a long time that the Sri Lankans have forgotten that this is a British import, and now actually are resisting any change, saying that the movement towards decriminalizing homosexuality is actually a Western force. And in the words of Alanis Morissette, a famous Canadian, isn't that ironic? So anyway, when you talk about civil society, I think if you had money, if you were from a high society in Sri Lanka, it really didn't matter what uncle or auntie was doing. It was just accepted. But if you are from rural Sri Lanka, the problem was not whether it was actually illegal or illegal, because in Sri Lanka it is no longer a big issue. There are organizations like Equal Ground who are working really hard to overturn these legal barriers. But right now, Sri Lanka is a very safe destination. And most importantly, it is being what we're really dealing with on ground is the locals being harassed and intimidated and maybe being blackmailed by the police and all of that. So it's a very complex situation. And we have in the past in civil society have a lot of architects, artists, writers. Shyam Saludare wrote Funny Boy. I think a lot of you are familiar with him. When I was a teen, that was a character, Shehan, that I could easily identify with when I was struggling to find who I give myself a definition. But in Sri Lanka, it's, I think anywhere these artists and these entertainment people, writers, they anyway speak up about these odd things. But what we really need people in Sri Lanka to do is like the medical fraternity, the lawyers, the psychological associations, and all of these people who have a lot more credibility and the general public will look up and listen to. We need them to speak up. So, and these people are represented in the private sector, not just in, and professionals. And finally, I would say, considering that we operate a LGBT business, we are LGBT owned and we operate LGBT business in Sri Lanka, we know the pulse and we know Sri Lanka is ready and primed for universal acceptance of LGBT rights. However, it is a very politicized issue, so it needs to be handled very carefully. The private sector needs to step up, like we have. And anyway, the question is not when, actually not if, but when. So I think we are quite ready for that. And more people with credibility who can push the mass mindset of Sri Lanka towards understanding and accepting LGBT people as part of their community. That is the key role, and the private sector has a huge role to play in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dee. So my next question is to Helen. So Helen, as I mentioned earlier, we have witnessed a completely unexpected shift in public attitudes in North America on human rights of LGBTI people. In your opinion, what were the drivers of social change? What role did the private sector play? And do you think that there is a recipe for social change that can be exported to places like Sri Lanka?
Well, I think that certainly the driving force in Canada has been the courts and LGBTI organizations and lawyers taking equity-seeking rights through the courts. And whether it's pension rights or marriage or adoption rights, the majority of the rights that we have achieved here in this country have been achieved through the courts. They haven't been done at the political level. It's been forced on the political folks to make these changes. And I think that that is pretty much standardized across the globe in terms of how this works. In terms of the corporate piece, I think that the corporate world has a role to play, has a very significant role to play. However, it needs to be systemic. It can't be, and it needs to be in partnership with. It can't be check the diversity box and move on. You have to look at all of these human rights issues through an intersectional lens. If you isolate your groups, well, we're only going to deal with women now. Well, LBT women. You need to look at this through an intersectional lens. LBT women and cis women with disability. You have to look at all of the pieces that make the change from the corporate perspective. I think if you're doing it in isolation, then you're doing it a disservice. And I also feel that the corporate environment and the corporate workplace needs to look at their own policies, needs to do really, really hard work and ask hard questions around their own employment standards. What are their forms saying? How are they bringing people in? How are they reaching out to the most marginalized? And how are they using their power and their financial clout to affect positive political change in countries that they have access to, where we on the ground, we know what the issues are. You need to talk to us and we will tell you, is it safe to release a video in a country where the backlash may actually be worse for the LGBTI people living on the ground? This is why it's so important to have these exchanges, to talk to each other, so we know what the other is doing, and so we can help guide the dialogue and guide the narrative in a way that isn't going to have a negative impact on the LGBTI groups within those communities.
Well, thank you very much. And I love your point about a more systemic approach and also the fact that it needs to be in coordination with civil society.
Absolutely.
And that's something we reiterated a lot in the standards, right? Because we have seen cases like in Uganda where the private sector can take steps that are actually not really useful And my old employer, the World Bank, withdrew a loan to Uganda to punish them for the anti-homosexuality bill. And activists described it as the kiss of death. They were like, they already don't like us because we are gay, and now we are in bed with the World Bank, you know? So you always have to be, you always have to definitely have a look at what civil society wants and what civil society finds useful. So dear Sean, Hornet is the world's second largest gay social network, or at least that's what you tell us. And it's present in many of the most hostile environments for LGBTI people today. So my question to you is, based on, on what you have observed, do Hornet users actually travel? And do they travel to these hostile environments? And do your users express concern about their safety when they are using the application, as an example, in some of those hostile environments?
Absolutely, that's a lot of great questions. So for those of you who don't know, Hornet's a 25 million user gay social network. We also run the largest LGBT newsroom in the world, and we publish every day in 7 languages. And for better or for worse, many of my users are in some of the most discriminated countries around the globe. And recently, you just heard Peter Jordan present yesterday talking about some of the research we were doing. And so we were surveying people not just in developed markets, but also in hostile markets, whether that's Russia or Turkey or a place like Thailand, where you might not think there's travelers to your markets. But in that research, we saw that 43% of kind of average gay men in these markets have traveled to Europe, and 90% say they intend to go in the next 3 years. On the flip side, what you're asking is how many of our users go to a hostile market. So there's 70 countries in the world where it's illegal to be LGBT, and that number is a single-digit percentage. So we mentioned 43 and 90%, so that's a pretty significant difference. And in terms of use, some of our fastest growing markets are places like Russia and Indonesia, and we still have 14,000 users in Chechnya. Wow. So it's one of the safer places to be gay is to be online.
I think that application actually play a tremendous role for people in places like Chechnya, in which they actually have no other way to get out of their isolation than this application, which is a revolution from when I came out 20 years ago, where you had no way to meet gay people besides getting out of your house and coming out. So Kevin, even though my role here is to only talk about human rights, you know, I think that what I have observed is that the business and economic case remains extremely powerful when we speak to businesses, right? And in many ways, they're more receptive. If they're more receptive when we talk about the fact that there is a cause to exclude LGBTI people than when we tell them, you know, including LGBTI people is the right thing to do. Do you believe that there is a business case to be inclusive in Bermuda? And in your experience, are people sensitive to this argument? And are you able to quantify the contribution of the global LGBTI population to tourism in Bermuda?
So we've just been through this debate in Bermuda. So what you should know is Bermuda is an incredibly friendly and welcoming place. We got rid of those laws, those British laws that Dinesh was talking about in the 1990s. You know, we got rid of buggery. You know, in Bermuda we have same-sex partner immigration. We have same-sex partner adoption rights. You know, gays and lesbians are free to serve in our military, such as it is. And yet in December, we found ourselves in world headlines around being apparently the first place in the world to repeal gay marriage, which was A, untrue, and B, seems to forget about the 5th largest economy in the world, which is the state of California. So the conversation in Bermuda has sort of been unfolding in that background. And what we found is, yes, there is very much a business case around the value of LGBTI tourism, certainly. But actually, there's a much bigger case to make about the economic value and the business case for inclusion and equality more broadly. So, and we have quantified it. So for Bermuda, a small place, it's kind of hard to make the argument for LGBTI tourism is really going to ring the cash register in Bermuda. We're never going to be Provincetown or Key West or South Beach. But actually, with three things you should know about Bermuda. The first is we're not where you think we are. We're actually about 750 miles from New York City. So for us, the relevant market is the East Coast gateway cities and Toronto and London, and that's where all of our visitors come from. The second thing to know is that 85% of the growth we've seen in the last couple of years as tourism has come roaring back in Bermuda is coming from people who are under 45, who are much more diverse, less white, less straight than our traditional visitors. And the third is that Bermuda isn't cheap. Bermuda is not a pure value-driven holiday. So when we actually look at the population of people that live in East Coast cities who earn a higher household income, who are under 45, find that actually equality and marriage equality is a big deal to just about all of them. There's a small pocket of people in Washington, I think they're Republican congressmen, for whom that is not a value. But actually what we found was that the way Bermuda was being presented on this issue put us out of step with the values of 80 or 90% of our target audience. And actually, we find that is a much more compelling economic argument than one that's purely about kind of pink dollars when we're talking to our stakeholders.
Thank you so much. I thought that Republican congressmen spend their vacation in North Korea, so I'm interested to know that they are going to Bermuda.
Or on Hornet, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We can talk about that, I'm sure. So my question will be to Dee, and actually, if we can put Dee's slide, because Dee had 2 slides about his guest house in Sri Lanka. I don't know if we can put the slides up. But anyway, so my question to you, Liz, we are living unpredictable times, as I mentioned in my talk earlier, and talk is cheap. Right? A lot of companies, those companies that are on the screen I do love because they have expressed support for the standards. But there is a lot of companies that position themselves on LGBTI issues and are actually not doing much to bring social change, particularly in hostile environments. What do you think businesses and the tourism industry can do to contribute to the social change you're talking about in Sri Lanka? And do you have examples of some steps that private businesses have taken in Sri Lanka that are contributing to triggering these conversations?
Yes, okay. So I think about 2 years ago, there was a bill presented at the cabinet meeting which seek to decriminalize homosexuality. And for the gay community, for the LGBT community in Sri Lanka, it felt like when you guys felt like standing outside the Supreme Court when the marriage bill was about to be passed, that day was we were all in suspense because there was this real possibility that this thing could go through. But unfortunately by evening, the president and some very political-minded, culturally sensitive ministers basically said this has nothing to do with Sri Lanka, this is nothing about, we don't have this sort of culture, this is all some Western import, and it was thrown out. At the time I was in Australia and I just felt so let down, and because I've been working in Sri Lanka for so many years, paying my taxes and all of this, and then to be told that I am not a citizen, I am not part of this country that I belong to, I'm not respected or wanted, I felt really bad. But I also wanted to make a statement that this is not about us. The moment the LGBT community steps up and makes a cry, they look at us as, oh, we understand, but this is what it is. It's not their problem. What we wanted to do was, because I come from a marketing background, I wanted a message that would go out saying that the wider community is with us. That's when I created this little, on the second slide, there was this thing with 2 hands saying, I'm with you. And I just posted it online and it went viral. The good thing is, it didn't go viral only within the community, it went viral amongst a lot of our allies and the wide world. And the comments was indicative that Sri Lanka was really, really ready for an acceptance. And with the right amount of awareness, it could go somewhere really, really nice. Now the thing is, a lot of companies do not see it like this. Because they are afraid of the bad PR, they are afraid of their customers, I mean, pretty much like around the world. So they are supportive, like, for example, the biggest companies in tourism, the John Keels, the Aitken Spence, they are supportive. I've actually spoken at a seminar held by Equal Grounds, how to be living as an out gay person in Sri Lanka's corporate world, to the middle management, because they were all in the hospitality industry at the time. But they are doing these little baby steps, but it's not helping the wider community. And I think that is where companies like myself, the one in Uganda, are really helpful, because we work with the LGBT community on ground. Our staff is LGBT. The people our drivers are LGBT. These people, our work puts money in the pockets of the community. And it is also, I think, a responsibility of global LGBT travelers to kind of see whether a safe destination is safe, but also when I travel with this company or when I stay at that particular hotel, what does it do to that particular community and how does it help that particular community? And I think that is the critical thing. From a business angle, we look at ourselves, our tagline is everybody's welcome. We really don't want to be seen as the LGBT company. That is besides the story. That is because we happen to be LGBT. But on our regular days, we plant trees, we rescue cats, we help the poor, and we ingrain that whole humanness in who we are, and that extends into the company. And so when we succeed as a business that is human, then that is a new model for the people out there who are always looking at just purely at profitability and the bottom line and ROI. And when that company happens to be an LGBT company, I think that sends out a much more stronger message about acceptance and what the private sector can play in this topic.
Thank you so much, Dee. Which brings me to my next question to Ellen. Ellen, your organization has actually a lot of links with the private sector. Do you feel that the private sector is starting to play its role? Canadian companies, right, are starting to play their role in pushing for social change in places where there are opportunities for the private sector to do something. And do you feel that there is an increasing conscience that they do have responsibilities and opportunities when it comes to that gigantic struggle, global struggle?
Yeah, I definitely think that they're moving in the right direction. I think that corporate responsibility in this area is something that they can, they know the economic benefits of LGBTI inclusion. They're very smart, but also they have a social conscience. I don't think that the word corporate is necessarily bad, and I think that our movement needs to look to the corporate environment more as an opportunity to advance our dialogue and our narrative around how we want them to play a role at the table. I think that what corporates do is they provide access. They give access to communities and environments that LGBTI activists on the ground don't normally or traditionally have access to. And I think that the more LGBTI organizations like IGAL and ILGA and this organization, for example, communicate and talk to each other, the more opportunities we will have to make positive change and to really impact the lives of LGBTI people. Currently, 2 weeks ago, the Commonwealth heads of government met in the UK. There's 36 countries in the Commonwealth that criminalize homosexuality. And I know that we had an opportunity to meet a group of activists with our Prime Minister in London. And I know that our Prime Minister delivered a message, a quiet diplomacy to other leaders at that meeting that it's not going to have a huge impact overnight. We're in this for the long game. It's not a quick fix. But I know that having access to those spaces is crucial for our work. And if we can't access spaces with corporate partners, then we're not going to be able to have a positive impact on the ground where it matters the most. So I think that the conversation is changing. And I think for me, I always say there's three things that are important in this work: leadership, politics, and timing. And if you get those three things to line up, then you can really move mountains and make the world a better place for everybody.
Thanks, Hélène. I did see pictures of this meeting between the activist and Justin Trudeau.
Yeah.
And my thought was that for any gay activist in the world, particularly gay male activist, having a picture with Justin Trudeau is like a dream come true.
I had to beat the gay men off to come to that meeting.
Yeah, I'm
there
pretty
weren't too many
sure.
lesbians
I'm pretty
putting their hands
sure.
up.
So Sean, I'm going to upset your competitors, but Hornet is basically the most socially responsible gay networking app, right? First of all, what is driving, you have launched a bunch of campaigns, and the last campaign that you have is about decriminalizing homosexuality. I don't know if you have a minute to talk about it. And then I would also like to know what is driving you to be so involved in the LGBTI movement. I mean, after all, you could run your business without touching the question of legal changes and social changes. And so do you have any advice based on your experience to companies that want to contribute to social change in those very hostile environments? And what can they do?
Yeah, many great questions. I'll probably answer them in a different order. One thing that's true for our users, whether they're in the United States or in a market like Egypt, is that they don't have full equality. And when we started Hornet, we had no idea it was going to be this successful. We just wanted a product that we were happy to use ourselves. And we were all activists before we built the product, and we continue to be activists. And we're geeky technologists from San Francisco, so we think technology and activism, much like corporate world, can also make a difference. I think the reason we launched the Decriminalize LGBT campaign this year is because I do a lot of work with WHO and UNAIDS, and HIV remains a big issue for gay men all over the world. And we can't expect that we're going to get ahead of HIV if these laws still exist. And we don't get to be our full selves if we're also facing legal and economic discrimination as well. So we want to push this forward. The hashtag is Decriminalize LGBT. We have many activations all year round, and we actually launched this campaign with ILGA and MSMGF. In terms of what businesses can do to make a difference for these markets, I think we have many lessons learned. Long before there was gay marriage, one of the issues that corporate America helped and won for us was partner benefits at work. And I can remember when Microsoft led that in early 2000, and they had faced a shareholder boycott, and Steve Ballmer got up and said he didn't care, he was going to do the right thing. And corporate America often can move so quickly. And I think one thing that's unique is our employee resource groups. And those aren't just checking a box for diversity inclusion. They actually can become a resource not just for the employees, but for the companies. So if you think about Marriott or a Hilton or a Hyatt, and they're going to be doing LGBT marketing, they can present this to their group. The group within the company can be their advocates on so many issues, and also being able to be authentic. So if you empower people around their passions, that's when you really have something powerful, and I think there's some leaders in this room around that aspect. And lastly, coalitions matter. And I was in Egypt at the end of last year because some of my users were being arrested for being gay, and I was very thankful that IGLTA sent a letter of support that said that this isn't good for tourism, this isn't what we're trying to accomplish. And I think that there's even more room for businesses to team up and to sign letters and to sign on to the UN global standards.
Thank you so much, Sean. And my last question, because I manage the time so well that there is going to be time for Q&A, even though we started late. I'm pretty proud of that. So my last question will be to Kevin. Kevin, in Bermuda's government, in kind of a schizophrenic move, banned same-sex marriage 1 year after making such a partnership legal last year. So it kind of made the headlines. First of all, do you think that's a big deal? And what was the impact on Bermuda's reputation? But also, what was the reaction of the private sector? And do you think that this reaction had an impact?
Mm-hmm. So, kind of overnight, Bermuda's relationship with the LGBT community went from, pretty hunky-dory to #it's complicated. What happened in December was that, off the back of what had really been 30 years of tremendous progress that put Bermuda, I think, significantly ahead of what we'd call comparable destinations, as well as, on things like anti-discrimination, 28 US states. We suddenly had this ruling. And it's complicated because it boiled down to this sort of superficial understanding of Bermuda repealed gay marriage. And that's not quite accurate. So what happened is, all the progress that we've made in the last 30 years has been these sort of fits and starts of judicial progress, legislative progress, social progress, and 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Last year, we had a court ruling which said that a same-sex couple could not be denied a marriage license. And so they started issuing marriage licenses. That's not marriage equality. That actually didn't give those now married same-sex couples all the benefits of marriage. And in what was admittedly a schizophrenic move, what the government of Bermuda did in December of last year was to pass a law that extended all of those benefits. So actually, for the first time, it brought Bermuda into line with the European Convention on Human Rights, but it took away the label. So it was a 1 step forward, 1 step back. And that does boil down to an unattractive headline. And I think the reaction of the private sector, I suppose if I talk about that in 2 parts. One is business in Bermuda, and then the other would be business for Bermuda. I think something else that we inherited from the British was a sense of decorum and politeness that meant we don't talk about our personal things in public. Feelings are ooh. So the private sector had been really quiet on this issue in Bermuda. They've been a kind of, don't make noise, don't stick your head out. And I think after the reaction that we saw from the international community and the way that this went kind of viral on social, I think the private sectors realized that they need to be part of that conversation and part of the dialogue as we now go forward. So, a good example of that would be Carnival Corp, which is domestically resident in Bermuda, rather than simply calling on Bermuda as a cruise destination. Yeah. Carnival register their ships in Bermuda. And Carnival had been completely silent on what they thought about this issue, but they've now actually weighed in. So Carnival is now providing kind of financial and other support to out Bermuda as they challenge the Bermuda government on this issue in court. In fact, it's going to court again in a couple of weeks. So I think it's been a wake-up call domestically. And then what we found is in thinking about business for Bermuda and thinking about how people thinking about coming to Bermuda as leisure travelers or corporate business thinking about bringing groups to Bermuda thinks about this, we've also realized that there is a need for conversation. We find that where it's left at this sort of superficial level of understanding of a 140-character tweet of Bermuda repealed gay marriage, we wind up with people saying, I don't think I want any part of that. When we get into the deeper conversation of what's really going on and talking about the transformative effect that travel can have in helping that conversation in Bermuda go forward, we found that people are much more receptive to engaging.
Thanks a lot. Well, what I'm going to do is, as soon as I get back to my room, I'll write to Carnival and ask them to express support for the standard. So. Well, because I manage the time really well, we have time for questions from the floor. So if there is no question, then we will ask Helen about what is Justin Trudeau in person, and Sean, how come I never found a husband on Hornet, and what do I need to do with the app? But before we ask this question, I would love to take, please, sir.
I'm from Sri Lanka too. This question for you. Unofficially, I heard the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister is gay. Is there any way that you can approach them and then push this gay issue?
So it's the gossip part of the panel.
You want me to repeat?
You can repeat the question.
Yeah, so your question is, the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister presume gay?
Yes.
And can I approach them?
Yes.
Tricky. So the politicians are in Sri Lanka live on pedestals in a completely different reality. The moment they are politicians, I think they lose touch with just about everything, not just for their gay side. So it's a bit difficult to go after them. And I think it's not about... Politicians will move once the vote base is affected. Politicians will move finally when they see that, okay, when I can pass this bill and the uproar is not going to be so significant. So there's a lot of work that people like us have to do on ground with communities, with the various sectors to kind of get to that level. So I'm happy if anybody can make that connection, but right now I don't.
Thank you so much.
Have you looked on
And
Hornet?
please, if you are going to tweet, that the entire Sri Lankan government is gay, please do not include my tweet handle in the tweet. Really appreciate it. We'll have. Any other question from the floor? So how is Justin Trudeau in person? No, I'm kidding. Nobody has any question for our panelists?
I'm curious.
Please, sir.
With Hornet, do they suppress the website in these countries, or is it the same everywhere? How does that work?
Great question.
We've seen interesting dynamics in this space. There's been times when Google has been the evildoer and removed many gay apps from markets like Korea. But Hornet individually isn't blocked in any jurisdictions, and we work really hard to ensure that.
Are the people then afraid to be on the site? Like, I mean, it has like the dating part. Is that what you call it? But you know, so like, are people, their profiles? I mean, are they afraid to be on the site in countries like that?
I think I'm old enough to remember before the internet, and God help us if you needed to go on a gay date. Where the hell were you going to go? Especially if you weren't 21. Like, were you going to wait at a bus stop and hope a gay man comes along? So
great idea.
even if it is, even when it is dangerous, yes.
Thank you.
There are markets where it is dangerous, but the gay men still go there because we need to connect. This is like the essence of life, is finding people like you. It's not about sex. It's just about even building a community, especially amongst young people who have struggling to accept their own identity, and it's a powerful thing. I remember the first time I got to connect with someone online and talk about being who I was. But we work hard in a lot of markets. So I went on the ground in Egypt when we faced arrest. I've been in Russia several times. I'm on my way to Georgia, Tbilisi, not Georgia in the US, which is also sometimes dangerous. And so there's just different tactics, but we do a lot of things in the app to help make it as secure as possible.
You know, but I'll give you an example, which is that a few years ago, I was reached, an activist from Egypt reached out to me because someone had been pulling pictures from online gay dating sites. And he had been reaching out to people and asked them to stop going on gay sites, threatening them to put their picture online. And he ended up putting their picture online. And so that activist reached out to me because my ex works for Google, and it was a Google blog. And Google within one day pulled out the blog, which was pretty amazing. You know, for once my ex was useful for something. But you know, that's a real risk. That's a real risk. Not my ex being annoying, but people, people using this material to go after gay people. And that's why we also have to have the strong links with the tech industry to ensure that they deal with the safety and the security of LGBTI people, because frankly, technology has a gigantic potential for our community, but it has also some risk. And we have seen recently the issue of Grindr disclosing the HIV status of its users, which was a stark reminder that with all the benefits of technology also come gigantic risks, and we have to pay attention to it. Is there any, please, sir?
Billy Colbert from Man About World and Hospitable Me. We typically see that a lot doesn't happen in the travel industry until consumers start demanding it. We see that with diversity, we see it with sustainability, and we get a lot of questions from travelers. Queer people travel all over the world, including all of these destinations. What can individual travelers do to help push the needle? What's appropriate for them to do in destinations? So I know a few of you probably have.
I'll give an element of response, and then I would love if any of you can take it. But in my opinion, I always, when I talk to students that come to the United Nations, they say, what can we do on human rights? And I tell them, well, look where you're shopping for clothing, right? Because, the fast fashion industry has gigantic human rights, issues linked to it. And, you can definitely influence human rights by where you're spending your money. And I think that's true. LGBTI tourists have tremendous power in putting pressure on Hilton, on Disney, for them to align themselves with their values. They can do it as customers, they can do it as investors, they can do it as stakeholders. And I think the private sector is definitely, has a conscience, as Ellen says, more and more, which is wonderful. But I think it also responds a lot to customers. And we just saw that amazing example of Starbucks in North America, right? Starbucks, there is a slight call for boycott of Starbucks, and immediately Starbucks said, I'm going to close my store for one day, and I'm going to give training on racial equality. And what it shows is that businesses are extremely receptive today to the pressure from customers.
So are you saying that travelers should threaten boycotts?
I don't think they should threaten boycott, but I think they should, one way to do it is to encourage companies when they are taking a stance on human rights. And another way is to use your money for companies whose values are aligned with yours, that are taking a stance for the issues you care about.
Fabrice, can I just jump in?
Go ahead.
I think that our community, the LGBTI community, especially in the Americas and the North Americas, have become very complacent and very privileged. And, we are very lucky that we can go to countries and we can have vacations and we can have children for the most part. But if you're Black or racialized and you live in poverty and you're trans, you don't have access to go to these communities. I think each of us who are privileged need to recognize our privilege and need to educate ourselves around what is happening to LGBTI people globally and to start paying attention. And I think that is the biggest impact that we can have. You can decide whether you want to go to Jamaica or Sri Lanka or Bangkok or wherever you want to go. But when you go to these countries, be aware of where you are and be aware of your privilege and what it means to be in these countries when people just like you don't have a place to live, can't eat, can't find a job. And to me, that is the most significant thing that we can do. Since marriage, I'll leave it there since you seem to agree with me. I'll quit while I'm ahead.
And Sean, I would also be interested to hear your views on boycotting company. Do you think that this is something that LGBTI customers should consider?
Yeah, I think that echoes on Ellen's point about privilege. So we have so many extra gay rights, and we need more, but we're certainly ahead of other parts of the world. And we've often ignored the LGBT organizations that work on international human rights and just focused internally. And I think that's come at the expense of human rights overseas. And I think so now that we do have more equality in many of our markets, it's time for us to focus on Outright and ILGA. And because you're travel professionals here, I've been really impressed with the work the IGLTA Foundation is doing and starting, and I know they're going to be doing a lot more. And the other thing I know about this room is that you're already citizen ambassadors. And I think that the rest of the LGBT community not as many of them are citizen ambassadors as you are, and you're doing business in these markets. And I think we can do a lot to empower our community to understand those kinds of values and to resemble more of you in this room.
Just to add to that.
So, but down to boycotts, I think those are headline-grabbing things that often lead us in a wrong direction. And we really can do something more thoughtful that builds bridges. And the only thing that makes someone become unhomophobic is getting to know a gay person like you. And so we need to be going to these markets. And there's probably smarter ways we can do it, but I think rainbow of hope when we visit these places and we can talk about what our lives back home is like.
Hashtag rainbow of hope. Mr. Crayon, what is your question?
Yeah, so Phil Crayon, NGLCC, thanks so much. This is really interesting. I want to pick up on these last 2 points because that really cuts to what I see as the heart of this discussion on human rights and tourism. So you're speaking to, as tourists going to other countries, to be cognizant of our privilege and to understand the cultural context in which we work. But the other side to this is that we're talking about tourism, which is both a public sector issue, so the government and their policies on tourism, as well as a private sector issue, so the corporations that are actually leading these trips, et cetera. So I want to know your recommendations for specifically either the public sector or the private sector so that they can better interact with civil society on the ground in these countries. Fabrice, what I like about the standards, the UN standards, is that there's actually many points for these corporates to liaise, to learn from civil society. But what I'm noticing outside of this is, particularly as we focus much more on the role of the private sector in these spaces, is that there's less and less space for this bottom-up approach. There's less space for civil society interaction with corporations. So to turn this back to the issue of human rights and tourism, I want to know specific recommendations on how either governments or the private sector can directly liaise with civil society on the ground so that we do understand that cultural context.
Do you want me to jump in on that one?
Yeah,
So
please.
So, I think it actually does tie it all together really nicely. In December, we were on the receiving end of hundreds, if not thousands, of angry notes from consumers saying they were absolutely boycotting Bermuda and never going to come. And I think they were surprised when we wrote back to each and every one of them. And we would ask questions like, well, where are you going to go instead? And we'd answer like, I'm going to Antigua. And it's like, really? You might want to educate yourself a little bit about that. And I think what we've then found in the dialogue that happened there is that we have a role to play as a public-private sector organization in helping make some of those connections happen. So what we found is that there are a group of empowered experiential travelers out there that want to put their money where their values are, but don't actually really know how. And so they wind up doing it at this really superficial level of, I'm boycotting an entire country or an entire company, rather than knowing how they can get involved and get connected. And so when we've offered to visitors that were concerned by what was happening in Bermuda, that we would help them find connections in ways in which they could come and participate in the conversation, they've actually been really receptive. And so I think that has, we sort of sit in the middle of public and private. I think private sector organizations and governments can help play that role as well. What Carnival are doing in Bermuda is one extreme, but actually just helping connect visitors to organizations in civil society, like in our case, Out Bermuda, is one way that travelers can then get involved, and they need some help in making those connections.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that for us, it's really important to do solid research and to partner with academic institutions, and like the Williams Institute in UCLA, or there are great organizations here in Canada too that are doing really good research on LGBTI inclusion and some of the issues that are impacting our communities. So when you look at taking that data and going and having these conversations, it's much more based in fact as opposed to based in anecdotal evidence, which I think people respond to the story on one hand, but you need to support the story with the data. And when you have that type of information, then you can start building partnerships and networks that really can infiltrate and spread to the broader society. I mean, in Canada, we have amazing legislation, but we don't have, legislation is here and cultural acceptance is very much here. Our hate crimes against LGBTI people are the most violent of any of the hate crimes in this country, and we have great legislation. So you have to work on that cultural shift, and you do that through education and research and changing a culture, and it takes a very long time, right? It's as I said before, it's the long game, and it's organizations like this organization, like ILGA, like IGAL, that are doing this work and building these partnerships and networks that ultimately will affect that change. But it takes a very long time. And it's a holistic approach, really.
So
it's not a quick fix.
So I'm smelling lunch, I think. So I will take one more question and then we will break for lunch. Anybody?
I'll ask one. Thank you. Thank you very much for your panel. It was really enlightening and very interesting. And I just actually wanted to pull out sort of one small piece of this conversation, because we are using LGBTI, LGBTQ as an overall umbrella, but especially when we're looking into emerging destinations, it often gets tied to gay men as compared to the transgender issue or the lesbian issue. And I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts on this as to how we can try to extend that conversation when it gets on the ground to actually consider women and trans who are already sort of facing like a double challenge. Just being a woman in these places is difficult. How do we go about extending that beyond to like the lesbian conversation or the trans conversation?
I love that question. You know, I traveled to India in 2012, and then I went back since then. But in 2012, what struck me is that if you have same-sex attraction in India, and you have some agency and you're a man, you can in a way try to escape, the burden of the homophobia of your community and your family. You can make a life for yourself if you are courageous and if you have a diploma. But for women, it's impossible. I went to visit a refuge for women, and when I get there, the woman explained to me a lot of girls fall in love with other girls. They escape their family, they are caught, they escape their family, they come to the refuge. And then they realize that they have no agency. In fact, they cannot even get ID paper without their family. And therefore, after a few days, when they realize that there is no escape route for them, they come back to their family. And they enter a forced marriage, and that's the end of it. Men definitely have more agency, even though it remains extremely difficult. And as Hélène pointed out, the burden of homophobia in places like India is particularly heavy on the poor, which only chance at livelihood is to remain connected to their community and family. In the standards, we are reminding constantly companies that even though we put together LGBTI people, there has to be a nuanced and differentiated approach. And our experience is that there is actually places in the world where you can have conversation on transgender people, like Pakistan, India, other places, but you cannot have discussion on gay men or lesbians, right? And so therefore, you have to have a nuanced and differentiated approach. I mean, the truth is that gay men are constantly, have the power, are more represented, and therefore we have to do an effort, to reach out to trans organizations, to intersex organizations, and to lesbian organizations that tend to be less connected, that tend to have less funding, and we recommended that in the standard, which was to have this nuanced and differentiated approach.
Well, I think I'm the only out lesbian on the panel.
Probably true.
I don't want to stereotype anyone.
We don't know. We don't know, but we guess.
Yeah, I think, that we have to look within our own community for how we can support each other. I think that the one thing that we have in common as communities is that we're queer. But we have the same political differences in our community. We have misogyny in our community. We have sexism, racism, transphobia, biphobia in our community. So we we shouldn't automatically assume that because we're all queer that we're all going to get along and push for each other's issues. So I think that the LBT folks within the spectrum, they're very diverse. We're very diverse in our politics and what we believe in, and we're also racist and we're also transphobic. So we have to do our own self-reflection. But organizations like ILGA and IGAL and other human rights organizations around the world have to start partnering with women's groups, have to start talking to feminists from the 60s and 70s about what does it mean to be a woman. How, what is a woman? How do you define gender? Are trans women included in the gender conversation? And we have to start partnering with and having uncomfortable conversations with groups like Black Lives Matter, for example. These are important conversations. They're very uncomfortable for some people, but we have to have them. And I think we will only push the pendulum when we start having these conversations and do it in a way that is open and feel okay about it and don't feel threatened or fear. Because for too long, straight people have been afraid of us because they don't want to have a conversation about what it means to be queer. And I think that, I always say that we have the responsibility to take these issues on and to advance the dial for more inclusion and, it's kind of my take on it.
Well, thank you so much. And now it's 12:30 and you can have lunch because I manage the time incredibly well.